I'll be continuing today's theme of North Sea challenges. That's the topic of the day. Inevitably, there's a little bit of crossover with what was discussed earlier, but what I'll try to do is cover it from the Palantir perspective, and our particular area of expertise would be the economics, the fiscal regime aspect of it. What I'm going to do is start by setting the scene, and we'll present some statistics from Oil and Gas UK, some debt from DEC and from HMT that describe the situation we're in. And then I'm going to go on and look at UK's fiscal regime particularly and what the issues are with that. And we'll focus on the hub and decommissioning issues. They're a very big part of the Wood Review. Anyone read it? And I'll touch very briefly at the end on integration with onshore gas. This is a new domain for us, and it is of interest to integrated operators in this sector. So we'll start by looking at a history of production. There are a few things to note about this. We're pretty much aware of the recent decline. It has been averaging around 13% for many years. This one stops in 2011. The theme continues. But as was mentioned earlier on, we can expect the decline to tail off, at least temporarily. And we'll talk about some of the reasons for that as we go through the presentation. The other thing that I want to talk about here is in the early days of the industry in the UK sector, it was dominated by large fields. We had the Brent, the Forties, the Ninian, the Piper. And I think the fiscal system evolved around the dominance of these large fields. Going forward, I don't think very many people are really expecting to find any more of these, probably not even really expected to find things a quarter of this size. We're very much focused on many, I think it's around 300 fields in steep decline, late life, and smaller discoveries. Those who are committed to UK exploration on the whole are not expecting to find 500 million barrel fields. Okay. So I also want you to focus on this blue line, which is around 1992, 1993. It's an important year fiscally, and we'll come on and look at that a little bit later on. Okay. But from my perspective, for somebody focused on fiscal regimes and fiscal measures, it's a very critical year in the history of the UK industry. Before I proceed, there is a little bit of a hint here, and this is from the probabilistic perspective of what could happen to the decline in coming years based on bringing the probable possible reserves on board. Okay. Here's a repeat of something. This is also from Oil and Gas UK and DEC. This is a repeat of what we've seen earlier on. We're going to talk a little bit about the exploration activity. It's been touched on earlier that the exploration drilling is critically low. And I want to add some other possible reasons for that. Okay, we've talked about the high cost of drilling rigs. There's fiscal changes impacting that as well. Okay, so this is one of the major areas of concern at the moment, that unless we're doing exploration and appraisal drilling, we're not going to be making discoveries. It's really simple. I mean, the grassroots of this industry is exploration drilling. Yes, we need to work on the tail end of these declining assets, but there is still exploration activity. There still needs to be exploration activity. I mean, in the Wood Review, he talks about 12 to 24 billion still to be discovered, oil equivalent. Okay? That's not going to be discovered without exploration drilling. I think 24 is a little ambitious, perhaps. I mean, historically, we've had, I think it's 42 billion produced to date in the entire history of the North Sea. So 24, an additional 24 is a slightly ambitious target. Okay. And this is also interesting. This is an investment forecast, again from Oil and Gas UK and DEC. What I want to focus on here is this grey segment down here. Okay. Now, after the introduction of supplementary tax, they have, of course, introduced a series of allowances to enable more challenging fields, small fields, high-pressure fields, brown field, ultra-heavy, and so on. And you can see the forecast going forward is that that investment is utterly dominated by this wedge here of fields receiving allowances. Now this is important, particularly when we compare that to the need for exploration drilling, because the critical thing to note about exploration, pure exploration, is you don't know what you're going to find. And if you're running economics on exploration, you tend to assume this. Why should you assume anything else? So if you're running the economics of an exploration prospect, you're probably going to be assuming the worst case scenario for the tax regime. Okay? And so for exploration planning, these allowances are less powerful than they would be for enabling existing discoveries. Okay. Of course, we also have to consider the fact that decommissioning is a bigger and bigger part of the industry in the UK, and in coming years there's some huge sums to be spent on decommissioning. As an economic analyst, as a tax specialist, I'm particularly interested in the tax implications of this. The refunds associated with both PRT, corporate tax, and supplementary charge. I think that the tax implications, calculating them correctly, understanding the risk around them, are one of the key elements of the next few years for the declining fields. And the risk element is something I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. Okay. So we talked about the escalation of OPEX costs. The same is true of development costs. This is partly due to the high rig rates. I myself don't have a strong understanding of the reasons behind the increase in rig rates. It'd be great to have a little bit of a discussion about that afterwards. I have a much stronger understanding, I think, of the OPEX. I think is that the next slide? Yeah, the OPEX. We've seen this already, the unit operating costs increasing. Now, I myself don't necessarily see this as something we have to try and fix explicitly. I see this more as a side effect of the other issues, right? If you have late life assets, OPEX per barrel goes up. It's simple, right? If you have problems with production efficiency, OPEX per barrel goes up. So fixing the other two things means this fixes itself. So in terms of marching forward, producing a plan, I don't see so much of a need of focusing on this particular statistic. I think it will fix itself. As was mentioned earlier on, I mean, when we talk about OPEX, we tend to be talking about fixed and variable components. In some areas of the world, the dominant factor is variable. Certainly in the UK sector of the North Sea, you don't see production costs declining linearly with production as you reach late life. The variable costs tend to dominate where there's a transportation cost or something of processing fee associated with it. Okay, so that's setting the scene. I've extracted a few of my favorite quotes from the Wood Review, or ones that I think are most relevant to setting the scene. Okay, the first one is a little scary. Industry's expectation of at least a 50% reduction in field investment in the latter half of this decade. That's huge. Although I have to admit that in the slides I've shown you so far, it's told a slightly false story, because we know that investment in 2013 and probably in 2014 is looking very healthy. All right? My concern is that it purely revolves around a few fields that have been enabled via specific allowances, brownfields, and so on, and that it isn't sustainable. 12 to 24 BOE could be produced, I mentioned that already, and a sharp decline in exploration. So less than 150 million barrels being discovered in the last 2 years, and that's not much. Okay. I'm going to talk now about the UK's fiscal regime. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of it and what I perceive as being issues with it going forward, and why the fiscal regime is actually creating challenges in itself. I'm going to start off by talking about political risk, and what I should really say is political/economic risk. Okay. I'll talk a little bit in a moment about what we mean by political risk and economic risk. One thing about E&P companies is that they can cope. They're quite comfortable in operating in quite challenging places. They can cope with all sorts of risk types, on the ground security risk. Yeah? They can cope with political risk where there's a threat of nationalization or coup d'etat. E&P companies have been operating these environments forever, and they're reasonably comfortable in doing so. But there's other kinds of risk. There's economic risk, which can be inflation. It can be just the difficulty of doing business in a particular country. And it can mean the fiscal environment, the taxation environment, okay? A volatile taxation environment. So when we look at this, this is a view of the world as compiled by Control Risks. They have a great suite of data on global risk. And this is a blend of economic and other types of political risk. What of course we see is that Northwest Europe is bright green, which means low risk. Okay? And we see that vast swathes of Africa and Latin America are perceived as high-risk environments. But when I look at the UK, I colour it orange because of the fiscal environment. Okay? Despite being in a very stable part of the world, it is a very awkward place in terms of the fiscal regime. Okay? And there are other countries that are bright red, which have had a nice, slick, constant fiscal regime for decades. Okay? OMV was in Libya, and they had originally, when the fall of Gaddafi took place, there was minimal production impact. Obviously, recently there has been a production impact, but it's amazing how quite momentous changes can occur in a country, but the fiscal regime just continues. Okay. So I've talked a little about this. When we can talk about turbulence, coups, civil wars, nationalization. This nationalization one is a big risk for E&P companies. You've seen what's happened in Argentina, in Bolivia, in Ecuador a couple of years ago. Yeah? It is possible for a government to completely nationalize or implement a fiscal system which makes it impossible for E&P companies to operate. And there's little you can do. You can't really go to court. You tend to have to leave in those situations. But it's also worth noting what short memories or E&P companies have. Yeah? If Argentina was suddenly to offer a new contract now, you'd all go charging in. Yeah? To a certain extent, it's a part of the risk you accept, and to a certain extent, but it's one that is rarely properly quantified when analyzing economics. So I'm going to focus mostly on this fiscal regime uncertainty, which is where the UK really, really, really trips up. Okay. So this is a history of UK taxation. It's not really, it's a bit more three-dimensional than this, because what I'm showing here is how a field would be taxed at, how can I put this? A PRT-paying field continues to pay PRT. Okay? One thing I'm not showing here is royalty, which was also part of the fiscal system historically. I've just simplified it. Okay? So until about here, there was a 12.5% royalty that was also charged, and then it was abolished. Great. The abolishment of royalty is probably one of the most important things in our favor in terms of late life assets. Okay? It's royalties are very, very bad fiscal mechanisms when it comes to keeping assets producing into their twilight years. Okay, so what we note is that it's bounced around rather a lot. Okay? The PRT rate here started off at 45, it went to 70, it briefly went to 75, and then it went to 50 and then was abolished for new fields around 1993. Okay? That said, fields that were paying it continue to pay it at 50%. Okay? So we were then briefly in a 30% tax environment. Okay? Gradually, as oil prices recovered, the UK government reacted by slapping on basically a windfall tax, an additional 10% supplementary charge, and then ramped it up to 20 and up to 32%. Okay? So you can see the overall rate of taxation is climbing back up here again, and we're now at around 62%. And of course, for fields, the few fields remaining still paying PRT, we're up at 81%. And I thought that was a little bit cheeky in the Wood Review, that when he compared the UK's tax rate to the Netherlands, he referred to the 81% rate, which is not quite the environment we're in. But this is a history of knee-jerk reactions, okay, and provides no stability whatsoever to operators. And it's left a bad taste. Nobody trusts the UK government to implement a system and stick to it. So nobody sits there going, well, I know that if I develop this field, I'm going to be paying 60%, 62% tax. You just don't know what you'll be paying. And that history is a very hard thing to fix, because it's embedded in our minds that we don't trust the UK government to have a stable fiscal system. Okay? In truth, you could be paying anywhere from 62% to 30% because of the field allowances, but presumably we should be focusing on the full tax rate. Okay? The other thing to note about this is that, yes, they've increased it to 32%, to 32%, but the abandonment relief that goes with that has not been increased accordingly. That's stuck at 20%, okay, which is a bit cheeky. Okay. Okay, so let's compare it to our neighbours. Okay, we're in the North Sea. Compare that to Norway. Admittedly, it's high, but it's consistent, isn't it? Netherlands was at 70% for many years and then dropped it to just over 50%. I think this slide really graphically shows the difference in stability when compared to the neighbours, who we are effectively competing with for investment. And Netherlands and Norway both have interesting fiscal features which really help them to compete. We talked about the demand for exploration, or the need for exploration, and the difficulty with finding exploration rigs. Well, what does Norway do? They refund 78% of an exploration well the year after you drilled it. It's hard to compete with that, isn't it? And when we talk about abandonment, the Netherlands does something quite clever. Over the life of an asset, you have a tax deduction for the abandonment, an abandonment provision, which is built up. It's quite a complex formula. You build it up, you pay it over the producing life of the asset, and then you don't have to worry about the tax implications at the end. It's dealt with. It's history. So I think we failed to learn from the good. There were lessons we could learn from our neighbours, and I don't think we're managing to do that. Providing long-term stability is important. How we can convey that to the investment community or to the oil and gas community, that is the case, is going to be a challenge. Okay, this is a slightly busy slide, so I'll apologize for it. I just decided it was useful to overlay price on this. This is really interesting, because when we looked at the history of production from the North Sea. Now we're looking at the history of tax receipts. Okay? And what's really important, that blue line I drew on the production slide earlier on, here, is where they abolished PRT. Okay? Of course they're going to abolish it. They got nothing from it. Okay? It's very simplistic mentality that's been used, and a series of knee-jerk reactions. So this is really interesting, that how far in a hole the UK HMRT's tax receipts were at that time. Okay? And of course we can expect this PRT piece to gradually decline, and we can also expect it to become negative, perhaps at some point, since there's only a few PRT paying fields, and there are some significant PRT abandonment refunds that will occur in future years. Okay, so one thing you have to remember about the PRT is it'll be a negative tax burden on the Treasury at some point. Okay. So this is very volatile, and I think you have to note there's also quite a big lag between setting a tax policy and seeing the effect of it, probably several years. companies are already probably committed to their certain drilling activity, to certain developments, and are unlikely to cancel them very close to the time they're actually going to do them. But it's certainly true that they'll reconsider developments, and it happened recently. That's one of the things that triggered the introduction of these field allowances. I mean, my own view is that when they introduced the supplementary tax and increased the rate of supplementary tax, the introduction of these allowances was almost a disaster recovery mode. There was inevitable collapse in investment, and they quickly introduced these to try and recover some of that. If they just introduced the allowances at the same time as a supplementary charge, people would have known what they were dealing with. Okay, I'm interested in this as well. Maybe somebody else can help me understand it. The lag here between the price and tax receipts. If anybody has any insight into that later on, let me know. Okay. So this is just viewing the same sort of data in slightly different terms. If you had licensed the field in 1982, okay, you would have started off here paying just over 90% tax with the combination of royalty, PRT, CT, and SCT. Okay? Assuming no costs, okay, just pure revenue. Gradually that dropped as they reduced the CT rate from 52%, and then it dropped further as they dropped this PRT rate down to 50%. Okay, and then there was a further drop in CT, and then later on it went up again with the introduction of supplementary charge. So you can see a PRT paying field has seen its ups and downs in overall tax rate over the years. If you were to license a field in 2000, then initially you would have been paying royalty. It was then abolished, and you went to a 30% tax rate with the earliest rate of supplementary charge, the 10%, and then a 20% and 32%. So you've gone here from a just shy of 40% to over 60%. Now, if you're planning a development, you kind of like to know, it really, really helps to know what tax regime you're going to be facing as you go forward. We face so many uncertainties in this business, and that's one that is possible to remove. You can't remove price risk. You can't remove other risks. But this is one that it is possible to remove. So now if we were to license a field this year, well, I guess you could be paying anywhere from 30 to 62%. Probably the most likely thing is it would be either the full 62% or it would be 30% for a few years while you consume your allowances. And then you'd be at the full 62% rate. So it's quite a colorful variety. Okay. So this is the cartoony, classic cash flow from an oil and gas field. Investment, revenue, abandonment. And we're going to focus on this tail end because this is what we're talking about so much at the moment. Okay? We're talking about late life assets, and we're talking about managing this window. Okay? So I guess this is a key feature from the UK perspective is, yes, we have this looming abandonment cost, but of course we get a partial tax refund. Okay? Now, one of the things that has made so many E&P companies nervous in recent years, and there's been extensive press coverage about it, is uncertainty and risk around this piece. Okay? It's very hard to commit to investments if you don't know if you're going to get that. And so I think it was 2 budgets ago, the Chancellor did try to enshrine that and give E&P companies confidence that it will occur. I wouldn't say that the risk has gone away altogether. I would say it's reduced. So that's one thing they've done successfully. One of the reasons it's so important is that, let's say, for example, you're trading assets at this, buying and selling assets at this stage in their life. Yeah? The difference between the cash flow with and without that is huge. Yeah? It's such a critical part of the risk of evaluating the asset that it's important to know it's there. Okay? The other reason we're focusing on this window here is, of course, the mission, and about half of this report focused on it is enhanced oil recovery, focusing on keeping fields alive, extending this window. Often we're talking about critical infrastructure, okay? This field itself may be of minimal value, but in terms of an enabler for surrounding fields, it's got huge importance. So from my perspective, this particular section of the field's cash flow is the important bit in a big chunk of the North Sea at the moment. Okay. So imagine you're a company. Your speciality is extending the life of aging fields. You have good technology you can apply to it. You decide you want to buy an asset off another operator who has no interest in such things or doesn't have that capability. So you do your P10, P50, P90, you look at your cumulative distribution of possible values. And you know, if the asset with its current owner looks a bit like this, your P50 is what about 75 million, your P90 is about 60 million, and your P10 is 100 and something. You think that by the application of some enhanced oil recovery techniques and technology, you can improve that, yeah? So you're pretty sure that your P50 is going to be here, your P10 is up there, and your P90, well, it's unlikely to be any worse than what's already there, but you might see that the technology fails, you've increased your OPEX, and therefore the value of the assets, it's lower on the downside. But I'm just going to skip back a couple of slides now, but if there's any uncertainty about this, your risk profile changes radically. You may think, well, I'm 80% sure that the government would give me that, but I've got some doubt. You suddenly have a P90 down here, yeah? Or it might be your P5, you know, it might be your P99, it might be something, but it does affect your decision making, all right? Suddenly that downside risk means you can't touch it. So if you can delete that point or shift it that way, then you've achieved a lot. And I think that is one thing that the Treasury has done a good job at, because we're trying to remove the risk of this occurring. I think the ability to trade assets is quite important. Okay? One thing you may be aware of is that the abandonment liability passes back to the seller if you as the buyer go out of business. Right? So there is always that cascade back. So the big messages from my perspective are instability. We have a long-term image and trust issue, which I'm not sure how is going to be fixed very easily. And the sense, from my perspective, of ad hoc bolt-ons, all these field allowances. Yeah? We don't really know what's next. So what could be done? One thing that interests me a lot is what we call a fiscal stability guarantee or enshrinement. You see this in many other parts of the world. And I put a Peruvian flag on there as an example. When you get a license to produce a field, they put a fiscal stability guarantee into the contract, meaning this tax regime will apply for the duration, full stop. Okay? It's magic. It takes away a risk, an uncertainty. It makes decision-making easier, reduces your standard deviation of somehow. Okay? There's an argument for saying that we could replace all the multitude of field allowances with a single progressive fiscal feature. Rather than singularly identifying HPHT or small fields, whatever, just say some fields are more economically challenging than others. Yeah? Have a single progressive feature, maybe an R factor or something, which taxes the successful fields highly and the more challenging fields at a lower rate. Okay? There's also an argument in here for having a special tax regime for southern North Sea. Gas is less valuable, it's more challenging. Perhaps it deserves a separate fiscal system. Okay? So the abandonment security, I think that'll add a lot to scope for enhanced recovery. We could also think about generous terms for incremental production. In many parts of the world, you may have a state-owned field and they bring in an operator simply to rejuvenate the field, and they get a contract specifically for that enhanced production. if we could offer more generous terms for activities like those, we may be going somewhere. And then I put the Norwegian flag here because I talked about their upfront relief for exploration. Is this something we can emulate? Is this something we want to emulate? It's certainly been useful for Norway. So I'm just going to show you an example of this enshrinement. Here's a Peruvian contract. Guarantees the contractor a tax stability during the term of the contract. Okay? It's right up there at the beginning of the tax section. And I think that's incredibly powerful. So, going back to the Wood Review, a few more quotes that I think are relevant to what we just talked about. The need for fiscal stability consistent with the challenges of maturity. Okay? And what I've been talking about, clear views that fiscal instability has been a significant factor in basin underperformance. Okay? The certainty, I would say certainty is a slightly strong word. The increased confidence over decommissioning tax relief has been well received. Okay? Okay. And I mentioned SNS meriting a different fiscal regime. He mentioned that. And the possibility of allowances to incentivize the EOR. Now, that could be allowances, or it could be a special contract for EOR. Okay? It doesn't sit so well with the UK fiscal system and the way we contract things. It's more something you find in service contracts, PSC kind of environments. But there may be something you can do with that. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about hub issues as well. Again, the Wood Review talks a lot about infrastructure sharing and hub issues. I'm not going to go into the detail of hub modeling, because we've done that in a previous presentation. But I am going to go through a brief, simplistic numerical example, just to prove that even with a simple case, it can be hard to get right. Okay, so excuse the numbers, it won't take long. This is just an example of classic infrastructure issues where different fields are sharing both pipelines and tiebacks situations. Okay, don't want to focus too much, it's just a graphical representation of what we're often facing in the North Sea. So here we have a simple hub. This is field 1, which I'm calling the hub, which is the infrastructure owner. And then we have 2 fields, one which is not yet on production, about to go into production, and another one which is on production, which feed into that hub and pay a tariff. So you'll see that the tariff column is positive here, it's a receipt, and it's negative in the other 2 fields because they're paying it. Okay? And what we see here is that obviously field 3 could theoretically carry on right to the end, but its economic limit is actually defined by the behavior of the hub. There's nothing you can do about that. Okay? So the economic limit of the hub cascades back and dictates the economic limit of the other 2 fields. In this example, field 2 would have abandoned at the same time. So I want to keep in your mind the values here of the total NPV and the total recovery. We're looking at one hub here, but the total is an important concept when we think about UK limited. All right? You could extend this to the wider environment. Okay? Because what we're really talking about here is maximizing these values, not for an individual operator, but for UK Inc. Okay? So if we were to just play with the tariff very slightly with this one, you could extend it a year. Here, I think what I did is I cut the tariff, or I increased the tariff by 20%. Okay? Which means I've extended the life of field 1, the hub, and I've got another year out of the whole infrastructure, just by a single tweak to the tariff rate. And you'll see that the overall NPV has increased and the overall recovery has increased. Okay? Now, the first thing to note is that the overall NPV of field 1, the hub, has dropped. So they're disincentivized to make this happen. And the power is in their hands under the current system. So there is a clear need to develop a regulator with enough clout to enforce or help encourage structures that lead to the highest overall value. At the moment, it's a very litigious, a very difficult legal environment when trying to arrange these contracts between different operators. And don't forget, we may be talking about multiple operators. You may find you have working interest in several of them, and it gets really hard to evaluate if you have if you have working interest across different sections of this. So obviously, most tariffs in the UK aren't just simple dollar per barrels or pound per barrels amount. They tend to switch to a cost-sharing mode, particularly late life. So if I convert this now to a typical cost-sharing system, first, this does extend the hub out to the end here. But then, of course, we find the economic limit of these two occurs earlier. And so the next stage is to take out the tariff receipts because they've gone sub-economic. And we now find that the hub is pulled back here again. Okay, this is the classic cascade effect of economic limits in the hub environment. Very, very simply represented here. Okay, but you can see under this cost-sharing system, we've dropped our total recovery and our NPV back down again. So I would say that the cost sharing is the most common model for late life assets in hubs, but it isn't necessarily the best solution. Okay. Here I've done one which is, I felt with the data I was working with was optimized. Again, it was just searching for an appropriate tariff to make this work, and we've added another year. So we've gone from 81 recovery to 93 up to 95. Okay. And again, it's the lowest value for the hub owner. So how are you really going to make that happen? So I'm very interested to see in the establishment of this new regulator how they can enable this. So apologies for it being a fairly simplistic example, but I think it does showcase what we're talking about reasonably well. So firstly, the optimal tariff is hard to compute. I've just showed you a simple example with 3 fields, very, very simplified example. In reality, they're quite complex pieces of infrastructure, many fields feeding in, and the calculation there is challenging and requires specific technology to do it. The other problem, as I've mentioned a couple of times now, is that the best solution isn't necessarily in the hub owner's best interest. And it's very much complicated by working interest issues. Okay. So that was just touching on some of the issues affecting us in hub modeling. So, yes, it might benefit from intervention by a regulator. I don't see any other way of overcoming some of the issues we've seen. It also does require confidential data from the operators. Right? You can't really compute this properly unless you have data from all of the parties involved, and they're not necessarily that open with their data. It requires technology, and it requires not just a regulator, it requires a regulator with teeth, which is not something we've ever really had in the UK. And quite how you arm the regulator, it'll be interesting to see as well. Okay. So again, a series of quotes from the Wood Review, touching on some of the issues around this. Removing dispute barriers, infrastructure business models, protocols and processes for dispute resolution, okay? Sharing in infrastructure, okay? So he does definitely see a need for this in the review, and you'll see it repeated over and over again if you read it through. I've only got a couple of slides on onshore gas. It's not really we're really talking about the North Sea here, so that's why I'm not going to focus much on it, but it is interesting. It's interesting to see what they're doing with the fiscal regime and how it might affect any offshore operators who are thinking of becoming integrated offshore and onshore players. So, first thing to note, and the most important, is that they've created a single ring fence. They haven't created a separate tax ring fence for onshore activities. Okay? The CT, supplementary CT, still applies. But they've introduced a new pad allowance. Okay? Now, with the other field allowances, you have to think quite differently, because with offshore or conventional onshore-offshore fields, you have a very specific reservoir to exploit. Okay? So your capital investment is very much associated with a specific, constrained, delimited reservoir. This is no longer the case with onshore gas. It's just a geological feature which continues ad infinitum. And so you can't have an allowance, a specific number of £1 million, because you can't necessarily delimit the field in the same way. It's sort of a rolling investment. And this is why this is quite clever, because it applies to any capital spent, or any qualifying capital spent, rather than to a particular reservoir. Okay? So I think it caters well to the physical reality. I wouldn't say it's particularly aimed at existing producers. One confusing element is that some of you may make use of the ring-fence expenditure supplement, the RFES, which is 6 years. They've extended this for 10 years for onshore gas. Now, quite how that's going to work within the environment of a single CT, supplementary CT ring fence, I'm not sure. I haven't worked that through yet. I'm not even sure if the detail is in place yet. If anybody has any insight into that, I'd be interested to hear about it afterwards. But there are issues there with modeling the extended RFES within a single ring fence. Okay? So I say here not particularly aimed at existing producers, because you have to wait until you have production. In the same way as other allowances, you can only activate them or use them on the basis of revenues from your gas. If you're able to get these and deduct them against existing production, that would be incredibly powerful for existing producers, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Okay. Just showing you some other challenges around shale modeling. It's a new subset. All of the rules about the way we analyze these things have gone out of the window in a way. It's a new subsurface domain, and we don't have a discrete reservoir with a single investment and a return. You can't compute a rate of return from a shale gas project. It's just not. It's a rolling investment, and you have to go into a new domain with risk and uncertainty, where you have each well you drill is an uncertainty rather than the field as a whole. So you get into geostatistics. It requires new software, and it requires new economic evaluation techniques, and there's quite a lot for us to learn if we're going to go there. So we can't use conventional techniques anymore, and we're used to doing optimization on the portfolio end. Now you have to start doing optimization up front on the drilling end, on planning a drilling program. And you have to start thinking in terms of geostatistics. So that's just a brief few slides on the new issues around shale gas. And that's the end. Thank you for your attention.